Let's kick things off with some disclaimers. This review is based on the PC version of the game. I haven't played the console versions, but I've heard mixed opinions regarding their performance, including that they're lagging behind with some of the significant updates and patches that the PC version has already seen since its launch. While this stuff may have been fixed now, or I could have been misinformed, I would probably recommend checking out the current state of things if you're thinking of investing in the console versions. Or, if you have the choice, maybe stick with the PC version, as that seems a little further ahead. Secondly, while this review will talk about some of the multiplayer elements and how they factor, it's primarily based on the single-player content. This was mainly due to the fact that I struggled to get into a PvP match for some reason, and also because I have no friends, so I can't play co-op. Thirdly, this is a review of the base game, and doesn't cover Warhammer 40,000 Inquisitor Prophecy, the standalone expansion. This is because I haven't gotten around to playing it yet, and also I can't afford to buy it. Or to buy food. Please subscribe!
For 10,000 years, the Emperor's Inquisition have fought a secret war to defend humanity. We keep vigil in the darkness. We hunt among the shadows. We pass judgment upon the mutant, the traitor, and the heretic. We purge the world of the taint lurking among the stars. We are Inquisitors. We shall fear nothing. For we are what you fear.
I don't know if you're aware, but Warhammer 40k's universe is no joke. I only phrase it that way because for quite a while I'd assumed it was simply a story to allow the wargaming to happen, and any depth would probably be fleeting or ill-conceived. I've been playing Warhammer since I was very young, but primarily fantasy, or Age of Sigmar as it's now known. And while I loved the look and vibe of 40k, everyone I played with wasn't really interested in it, and the hobby was also something I drifted away from in my teenage years for a while. But when adulthood came, with all of its financial freedoms, I thought now's the time to finally make the leap to 40k and get back into it. As with many of my hobbies, I decided to really try and immerse myself. As a fan of deep, complex lore and storytelling in any medium, I thought to myself, I'm going to learn all the lore before I start playing. How stupid and naive I was. I had a friend at the time who was re-educating me as an adult on the newer rule sets, refreshing me on what I'd forgotten, and generally acting as my 40k oracle. When I told him of my plans regarding the lore, he paused for a moment and then burst out laughing uncontrollably. Confused, I asked him what was so funny, and without a word, he sent me a link to a lore video. Thinking little of it, I pressed play, and while I can't remember the exact phrasing, the opening line of narration in that video said something like, "Our story begins 4 billion years ago." That was the first of over 70 videos, and even all of them together were just an overview of some of the base story elements that have happened in 40k's lore. There are hundreds of books, short stories, comics, games, animations, movies, the list goes on. It's a universe so expansive that every single battle played the world over, every day, on tabletops, be it in 40k or an offshoot like Kill Team, are technically all part of the canon. Put simply, it's a world on a scale rarely seen in any popular culture property. As the video progressed, I was simultaneously gripped and overwhelmed. I'd finally found my lore Everest, and it's a metaphorical mountain that I am still climbing. Warhammer 40,000 Inquisitor Martyr is just one tale within this infinite, ever-expanding universe. It has a small collection of main characters, very few cinematics, and conveys much of its story and narrative through the use of conversations, mission structures, audio logs, and in-game collectibles. It would be easy to assume that such a tale might suffer from pacing or structural issues. After all, if it's too reliant on previous knowledge of the universe, then those new to 40k would be lost. But if it doesn't utilise any of the deep established lore, then what would be the point in making it a licensed Warhammer product? Unbelievably, however, it's in the miraculous marrying of these seemingly disparate elements that Inquisitor Martyr displays one of its greatest strengths. The game opens with a few lines of text. It is the 41st millennium, and there is no peace amongst the stars. The Imperium of Man is besieged from all sides by the Xenos races, and it's slowly rotting away from the inside, tainted by the Chaos Gods. Inquisitors are autonomous, powerful agents who wage a great secret war for mankind. They fight in the shadows, and nothing is beyond their authority. They are the judges, and the executioners. In just a few short lines, the stage has been successfully set. If the player knows 40k, then they probably know all of this information already. But the whole thing takes less than 30 seconds to bring everyone up to speed. You might not know some of the details, like what the Xenos are or who the Chaos Gods are, but that doesn't matter. You get it. It's the future. Mankind's fighting a losing battle. Inquisitors are serious. So let's talk about some of the narrative and storytelling techniques that continue to help this game appease newcomers and veterans of 40k. The essential opening premise is that a very large battleship/monastery named the Martyr has suddenly reappeared in a particular sector of space after a long absence. No explanation is known and the ship is seemingly devoid of its crew. The Inquisition has sent an agent, you, to investigate. This Mary Celeste or Obra Dinn style mystery creates a great narrative hook for the player, whilst also reaffirming a ghost ship premise, which has associated atmosphere to help set things up. But while this is an intriguing concept to anyone, the game never forgets that it's taking place in the world of 40k. So 40k is all about scale. When there's a conflict in 40k, billions, or sometimes trillions, die. The lore tells of tens of thousands of human psychers, essentially people who can utilize psychic ability by drawing energy from a reality overlaid on our own known as the warp, being sacrificed daily back on the human homeworld to keep alive a slowly decaying living deity that has been alive for untold generations. Every person in humanity's empire, the so-called Imperium of Man, is expected to die to protect its leader without question. Billions die in conflict on a daily basis, and mankind is in an endless war with threats known and unknown. Yeah, it's cheery. But while Inquisitor Martyr's story seems initially to be in contrast to such scale, even from its opening it actually never feels disingenuous to it. For example, the giant ship known as the Martyr has been missing, right? In any other science fiction universe, it had been missing for like 10 years, maybe 20. In Warhammer 40k Inquisitor, the Martyr has been missing for 5,000 years when it reappears. 5,000 years. Such a scale is one that feels at home in the 40k universe. Also, as the story continues, the scale elements continue to creep in, and you end up with a tale that could actually have ramifications on the entire 40k universe. But it's also kept separate enough, so it's not required for any other piece of media connected to the IP in order to make sense. It's expertly executed, lower budget, high concept science fiction, at least in its narrative, and successfully works as a piece of a larger whole or as a standalone tale. Warhammer 40,000 Inquisitor Martyr has been described by its developer, Neo Core Games, as a tactical ARPG, and I mention this because I believe it's a key distinction that should be kept in mind when approaching and analysing it. I recently reviewed Wolfson, Lords of Mayhem on the channel, a great ARPG that, despite its rocky launch and undeniable issues, is a worthy addition to the genre. Like many of its contemporaries, it's a game about speed, fluidity, and high damage numbers. And also like many of its contemporaries, it's great. But just because it works, doesn't mean every entry in the genre has to be this way. Warhammer 40,000 Inquisitor Martyr is a game that slows down the ARPG experience, makes it heavier, makes it chunkier, and for better or for worse, makes it more considered. While I'm not the first person to say this, and I'm sure I won't be the last, don't go into Martyr expecting a game like Wolfson, or Diablo, or Path of Exile. It's an altogether different beast. So let's dig into this a little more by breaking some of the core design and system elements down. Okay, so Martyr has three main character classes. The Psyker, essentially a mage class, the Crusader, a heavy-duty barbarian-style class, and the Assassin, a rogue type with lower health but much quicker movement. Each of these classes have three subclasses for the player to choose from, which essentially form a base for your character. These subclasses are much less permanent, as weapon types, gear, attributes, passives, and abilities that you invest in will dictate how your build ends up, but they nevertheless provide some great starting options. It is in these classes that we first see some of the tactical elements come into play, many of which serve to slow the game's tempo. For example, if you pick the Assassin base class with the Sniper subclass, you are able to aim at specific enemy body parts for increased damage, but to do so requires you to stand still and wait for the right moment. Such a mechanic almost feels like it would be more at home in the XCOM series, but because of Martyr's slower pace, it works. This is further augmented by slower enemies with much larger health, meaning everything takes on a heavier, more tactical vibe. Don't get me wrong, movement is just as important in Martyr as it is in any other ARPG, but it feels more intentional and mannered than, say, Diablo 3, where most of the player movements are reactionary. Such elements are consistent with each class type, and whether you're a heavy-set Crusader, repelling hordes of enemies from close range with a chainsword, a Sniper popping heads from afar, or a Psyker calling on the warp to summon huge destructive blasts, you will consistently find a slower, heavier, and more tactical experience. Also, one other note on the Psyker. I love how lore authentic this class is, with touches like having to watch your warp usage, or expel warp heat through other attacks, in order to stop accidentally summoning horrors from the other dimension. It's little touches like that that really serve to illustrate how much the developer cared about staying authentic to the source material. Suffice to say, movement and attacking in Martyr feels appropriate for the type of game the developer's making. And while different from other games to which it will undoubtedly be compared, it's still fun to stomp around and decimate hordes of enemies. However, before I continue, I should briefly mention the game's thankfully fleeting vehicle sections. While I appreciate the attempt to mix things up, they're just terrible. They control badly, they're unresponsive and unsatisfying, the enemies are lackluster, and the areas in which they take place are all bland and uninspired. Luckily, there's nowhere near enough of them to ruin the game, but my advice would be to speed through them as fast as possible when they come up. So let's round out how character progression works in Martyr. I mentioned earlier that your character is shaped through attributes, passives, and abilities. Attributes come in 3 categories, and while they vary slightly between classes, they generally have similar effects. One affects damage output, one affects defense or resistance, and one affects your ability cooldown. After putting enough points into any particular category, it will level up, giving you a milestone unlock, like percentage damage increase against a particular enemy, or when using a particular weapon type. Then there's passives. Stat boosts that are framed in different categories and can be leveled up further to customize your build. These tend to be slightly less specific than milestone upgrades, and are more along the lines of 150 point health increase, or 1.5% damage increase when using ranged attacks. Finally, we have abilities, and unlike many other ARPGs, these are not unlocked through leveling, but are instead tied to the gear that you have equipped. So, for example, with a Crusader, if you're using a shotgun, you will have specific abilities for that weapon, such as a scatter shot. But say you pick up and equip an assault rifle, those abilities will then change to something like triple shot or full auto fire. These are not generic for every weapon either, and builds can change drastically based on new equipment you might find. Of course, this now leads us to the loot system, which is a bit of a mixed bag. While weapons are often interesting, and the new builds they bring can keep things fresh, the actual looting process and ongoing quest for loot is only serviceable. I never felt any kind of excitement or anticipation when picking up drop loot, and much of it ends up being useless anyway, but occasionally I would happen upon something in my inventory that gives me that stat boost or new build idea that I'd been craving. I guess it speaks volumes that it basically always happens this way too, and I can rarely if ever tell you when and where I found the item in question. Such criticisms are mediated by a pretty good crafting system, as well as loads of other systems that become available to the player once they have access to the bridge of their ship. These include the usual stuff like a storage chest and a shop, as well as tons of other stuff like a crafting station, a station for augmenting healing parameters or damage output, an option for taking on side quests and optional missions, a large star map with procedurally generated tasks, leaderboards, mail, cosmetics, and the ability to construct your own endgame quests using ingredients gained throughout other missions. While it's a lot to take in and could use a little more explanation, the level of intuitiveness is probably high enough for most players to get to grips with everything okay, and the number of systems and options here is definitely commendable. As I alluded to earlier, there's also a PvP mode and co-op mode that can be accessed from the aforementioned bridge. As I also mentioned earlier, I was unable to get a game of PvP, but was generally confused by its presence in an ARPG anyway. Regarding co-op, it wasn't really the focus for this review, but my understanding of it is that it used to suck because it excluded the campaign, but I've recently heard that this has now been rectified. I wouldn't like to comment either way here for obvious reasons, but it may be worth checking out before you invest if you're in it for the co-op experience. The structure of missions is always a difficult one in a game like this. While most ARPGs are just about killing all the things until you reach the big thing and then killing that, the tactical elements that Martyr has included means that the game requires a little more variety. Now, don't worry, there's still plenty of kill all the things missions here too, but there are also defend this place or find this thing or person missions too. The most common by far though is the investigate this area mission, which is kind of just a different way of saying kill all the things on a map. Either way, this part of Martyr is again serviceable. And while it never really manages to overcome the inherent repetitive nature, which is simply a byproduct of the genre to which this game is attached, it does enough to keep you playing. So the other elements that are worthy of focus in Martyr when thinking about the game's design philosophies are its enemies and its areas. As with all good ARPGs and tactics games, these are extremely important, and the way they tie into gameplay can be the make or break. While I wouldn't say there's enough problems to break Martyr, I would say that these areas don't all come together as well as they perhaps were intended, or even as well as they could have, given a little more time and money. The best example of this is the game's cover system. Essentially, you can press and hold the spacebar to go into cover on some objects or environmental elements. While this is definitely a great idea in concept, it rarely works, with the cover providing little to no damage reduction, being destroyed almost instantly, or being placed in awkward locations. Also, I found that my character often wouldn't get in cover when asked, or would snap to the wrong cover surface. All in all, I would say that I used this system successfully very occasionally, but I wouldn't have really missed it had it never been implemented. Speaking of the game's areas, they're also worth a mention. While I'll go over the graphical fidelity of the game later on in the video, the area design is worth looking into here. Generally, most of the game takes place in ship or station corridors, all of which share a relatively similar aesthetic. There are some other areas including several planet types which vary things up a bit. These include snowy ice planets, desert-like planets, and more organic-looking planets, as well as several sections in open, war-torn areas and industrial locations. While the attempt to instill variety is welcome, this area of the game unfortunately still feels a little undercooked and limited, meaning that other than searching the corridors of the admittedly creepy Martyr, few areas will stick with you. Enemies are also somewhat of a mixed bag, although on the whole they succeed at creating more of an impression than the areas which they inhabit. What I will say, however, is that despite not being quite as varied or plentiful as some of its peers, the game has a lot more variety in enemy types than I expected from its outset. Tyranids, Traitor Legions, the Black Legion, and the Chaos Forces of Nurgle, among others, all make significant appearances. For the uninitiated who have no idea what I just said, basically there's a ton of weird aliens and hulking humanoids to obliterate. It's also worth noting that many of these enemies feel different from one another to fight, requiring different strategies and thankfully avoiding reskin territory. It's pretty clear that Warhammer 40,000 Inquisitor Martyr didn't have the biggest budget in the world. Despite having some great cinematics, the game fluctuates between looking pretty good and a bit janky. However, despite such criticisms, it's far from the worst looking game I've ever seen, and also manages to genuinely capture the feel and tone of 40k perfectly. This is in no small part due to great art direction and concept work, with lighting in particular being utilised well. It feels like the developer really cared about nailing that very specific Warhammer 40,000 atmosphere, and it shows, as creeping around the Martyr or blasting your way through hordes of chaos, you couldn't feel more like a member of the Inquisition, doing the Imperium's work in the name of the Emperor. Again, for the uninitiated, if that last bit made no sense, sorry. Basically, the game looks okay and has great atmosphere. Unfortunately, the sound doesn't fare so well, with unsatisfying and samey sound effects for most of the weapons and abilities, and a weirdly inconsistent soundtrack, which has some great tracks but lacks any coherence. On the plus side, the voice acting is strong, with great performances from all involved.
Strange. Vox communication is jammed and I can't use my teleporter device. Something must be disturbing my signal. I will record everything in my audio log, in case I don't return.
So when it released in 2018, Martyr had a few pretty big bugs, including several blockers and crashes. Luckily, these are seemingly all a distant memory now, and if you're picking the game up for the first time in 2020, this isn't anything you need to worry about. However, having said this, there are still a few smaller issues that don't really affect gameplay, such as weird animation bugs, the odd audio issue, and texture issues like Z-fighting. While infrequent and no doubt on the list to be patched in future updates, it's nevertheless worth noting as it can make the game feel a little janky. Now, let's talk about game length. Warhammer 40,000 Inquisitor Martyr is a pretty long game. Even just playing the campaign will take you around 30 to 40 hours, if not longer. But with all the optional missions and side content, this could easily be doubled. Add to this the endgame loot grind and the fact that you can craft your own missions to play through, on top of the procedural content that keeps being generated, and the free epilogue content provided by Neocore since launch, and yeah, easily 150 hours plus. Oh yeah, and now times that by 3 if you want to max out every class, available in just the base game. Needless to say, there's a lot of content here. So it's worth noting before we conclude that Warhammer 40,000 Inquisitor Martyr has changed a fair bit since its launch back in June of 2018. While as I said earlier, I can't comment on the console versions, having played the PC version on and off consistently since it came out, I can tell you categorically that pretty much all the changes are for the better on PC. While there are tons of fixes and changes detailed in the many patch notes that have come and gone over the many months, including the apparent co-op campaign implementation, there are a few things I think are worth mentioning. Firstly, the game has been sped up a little, and there have also been some health and damage rebalances. This has allowed it to find a much better and consistent gameplay rhythm when compared to its original launch. This neatly leads us on to the second change that has been implemented, a much needed difficulty rebalance. When the game launched, and for many months after, it contained several severe difficulty spikes, which were ridiculous. Even if you were over-leveled and geared up, you would get destroyed or fail objectives instantly. And to add insult to injury, one of these spikes was the game's final boss. Luckily, nowadays, the difficulty is about right, with a definitive curve and some challenging sections, but nothing nearly as infuriating as previously seen. I mention these things for two reasons. First, if you played the game at launch or looked into playing it and were put off by some of these issues, maybe give it another look now, in its refined state. And second, it shows genuine developer investment in the product. Add to this the bunch of free add-ons and events that have come from Neocore since launch, and the fact that more are reportedly on the way, and you can at least commend the levels of consistent effort being put in by the developer. However, that's not to say all the add-ons are free here. As I mentioned at the start of the review, the Warhammer 40,000 Inquisitor Prophecy DLC is a paid standalone expansion which doesn't require the base game to play. But on top of this, there are also smaller narrative-driven DLCs that cost real-world money, as well as cosmetic microtransactions. While not the most egregious by a long shot, it sort of feels like these elements have been played up a little since the game's release, to push for it to make a bit more money after it underperformed. Stuff like the fact that it now shows you the DLC missions in the side mission bridge menu, but then advises you that you can't play them without the DLC feels a little bit like fishing. Still, such criticism is a minor one, and I was pretty much able to ignore all this during my playthrough. So, when all is said and done, is Warhammer 40,000 Inquisitor Martyr a game worth playing? For me, the answer is yes, but with a few caveats. Firstly, don't go in expecting a Diablo-like experience. There are similarities, but Martyr is a slower and much more considered game. Secondly, don't go in expecting the best production values or a high-budget experience. This game is a high-concept, mid-tier game that the developer really cared about making the best they could. And thirdly, be prepared to suffer through the terrible vehicle sections. These criticisms aside though, Martyr is a game that should be commended and played by any fan of 40k or anyone who can appreciate what it is. A sometimes valid and sometimes failed attempt to make something we haven't seen very often, a high concept, tactical ARPG. And while there are a few elements of it that don't quite work or fall flat, the good far outweighs the bad here. Next time it's on sale, maybe check it out, because it would be great to see more of this story and more from this team. Also, let's take a moment to evaluate the state of the 40k gaming landscape. I love Warhammer, and I love games. You'd think it was a match made in heaven, but have you ever searched for 40k on Steam? It's a fucking dumpster fire. What makes this worse is that when they're good, 40k games can be great, and even nowadays there are still some diamonds in the rough, but unfortunately they're drowning in a sea of shit. Despite its problems, I would definitely say that Martyr is one such diamond, even if it's one that may have needed a bit more polish to shine as bright as it could have. Now, if you'll excuse me, I need to make a start on the Horus Heresy books for my lore research. Right, see here. Can't be that many to read. 56?